So we come to Hagseed, and we also come to the in-between, the textual conversation that we are having with the Tempest. And it's important as we're reading Hagseed that we start to consider that particular conversation. Looking at its introduction, we understand, of course, that this text has a framing device. Felix's version of the Tempest drives the introduction and drives the prologue. So we have the Tempest by Shakespeare with the Fletcher correctional players, something that already gives us a foreshadowing and an interesting thing. You have what tends to be, or what seems to be, the idea of a kind of slam poetry style here. What you're going to see is a storm at sea, winds are howling, sailors yelling, as you're just cursing him because it's getting worse, going to hear screams. So you already have the appropriation of language, you already have the transformation of ideas in the very opening part of the text. So from the get-go there is a conversation happening between the Tempest and Hagseed. And as we get to know this text, we see further information about how these people have rethought, reconsidered, reframed the Tempest itself. And then we get the proper story with Felix. Felix brushes his teeth, then his other ones. And we learn very quickly that our Felix is indeed our Prospero. So when we're saying, okay, which character represents other characters, we see Prospero in Felix. And of course, Felix has had this issue with losing his own daughter Miranda. So you can tell that Felix is or has an obsession with Shakespeare from the get-go. Okay? That devious, twisted bastard Tony is Felix's own fault. So we learn very quickly again that our Antonio character, Tony, pretty easy to remember, is going to usurp him, overwhelm him, overpower him. So these things are already occurring early on in the text. Okay? We learn what Felix was, and he's a director of Shakespearean works. Felix had always built in one or two plays a season for himself to direct. Once in a while he would even take the central part if it was something he felt drawn to. Julius Caesar, the Tartan King, obviously we learn who that is later, you know who that is, you can't mention it in theatre terms. Lear, Titus, triumphs for him in every one of these roles and every one of these his productions. So he is very strong, he's been very powerful, and he's been very, very engaging with his particular version of Shakespeare. We learn very quickly that he's lost his Miranda here with meningitis, a very modern way to die, of course, because it's something of which we don't necessarily have a proper cure. This is the consumption, the Black Death, the plague of our age. Okay, as we're moving on, say, even the 20th century plagues like HIV and all that, we're now in these super virus era plagues, and so Miranda dies again according to the design or will of the universe. There must be a reason, there must be a purpose. So much like his Prospero, we're trying to find his value again. So we learn that he is in sorrow pretty early on. Okay? I've got these things working. And this is what is, of course, pushing him to be Prospero on stage. Felix himself will be Prospero, a loving father, perhaps too protective, but only because he was acting in his daughter's best interests. This is, of course, how we see the Prospero of Shakespeare's time and of our time. Overprotective, but overprotective for purpose and value, acting in his daughter's best interests. That is a common phrase used by most parents. The Miranda we meet in The Tempest is unschooled and unaware of anything beyond her own world. So therefore, she is inexperienced, and that is why Prospero has to play that game with Ferdinand. Then we get, of course, the push toward revenge, the usurper, Tony taking everything over and rather unceremoniously dumping and destroying Felix's idea, taking some beautiful images and making them horrible and nasty. And this part here, this whole sequence about what it is that they couldn't do with Prospero's coat. And, okay, we get the animal skin cape was a bridge too far. They say you'd have animal rights activists down on us like a swarm of helmets. They're not animals, they're children's toys. That is not the point. They look like animals, okay? And the cape isn't the only objection. They draw the line at Caliban being paraplegic, all this kind of stuff. Stuff of which we're familiar in this day and age, that some of the texts that we have to deal with in their past that have requirements have to be changed and transformed for sensibilities of our time. So you're already getting a conversation with the Tempest, even in this sequence here. And that's important to realise, that you are sort of looking the whole time with what it is that is a conversation, okay? So keep that in mind. A section like this is really, really important, okay? The idea that Felix feels that his play is still worthwhile of production, and the reason they're finding things to be unacceptable is because in this day and age they're worried about demographics, they're worried about objections, they're worried about activists and so forth. For creep's sake, this is political correctness gone way out of control. It's in the text. He's misshapen. If anything, in this day and age, Caliban is the favourite. Everyone cheers for him. And there's a sense of how things have changed. We now cheer for the broken creature. We don't cheer for the one who has the power. And yet, if we produce him or present him on stage as somebody weaker than anyone else, we are going to create a storm of which will cause problems with society, the media, whatever it is. And the play will fail because it will be politically unsavoury for its time. Forgetting, of course, that it was that which made Shakespeare work. He pushed against the way of thinking of the time to produce a new and more immediate and incredibly engaging way of thinking. And that is, of course, problematic for any art. And so this idea of a discarded Tempest, how Felix reads the Tempest, is no longer of any value and no longer something that is interesting. Taking this to the Heritage Minister, he knew this was a non-starter. He'd gone to school with Sal and Nally. They'd been rivals. There had been a clash over a pencil stealing incident that Felix had won. He'd given it his opinion in several TV interviews that the Make-Shall-We Festival should be doing more Noel Coward comedies than Andrew Lloyd Webber and other musicals. Not that Felix had anything against musicals. He'd started his theatrical career in a student production of Guys and Dolls, but a whole diet of musicals. Sound of Music, Cats, Crazy for You, tap dancing, things the ordinary person could understand. But the ordinary person could understand Felix's approach perfectly well. What was so difficult about Macbeth done with chainsaws? Topical, direct. In point of fact, the Heritage Minister is in full agreement. Naturally, we ran our decision by Sal before the final vote to confirm we were taking the right path. So again, the question of the value of these texts in a modern circumstance, be they entertainment, be they offensive, be they whatever, is common and a real thread in Hag's Seed. And it's something that you need to latch on to, the conversation between our time and its time. These plays in their time, not necessarily the Tempest, but the early Shakespearean plays, were shut down quite regularly, and they were shut down by people called the Master Revels or whatever it was, for reasons of health and safety, usually the plague. It was a good place for disease to spread the globe, or one of the bros or whatever it was. Nowadays, of course, things are shut down because audiences don't get it, or they want to be entertained, or they just want a series of musicals. And as Felix says quite rightly, a diet of one thing, even in art, is very, very, very bad for you. You need to be able to experience other things. And the assumption that a modern audience won't understand this work of Shakespeare is an insult to a modern audience, really. But there it is, and he is thrown out. The secrecy, the sabotage, the snake-like subterfuge, the stupendous betrayal. Tony had been the instigator. He'd been the implementer. So my point is this. Do not just engage with the text in terms of, one person's Felix equals Prospero, Tony equals Antonio. They're easy comparisons to make. They're easy things to talk about. But it's also the conversation, as I've said before, okay? It's really important that we think about the context, we think about the value of Shakespeare in 21st century sensibilities. And that means understanding the politics of the time, the artistry of the time, theatre and so forth. They are things that matter to us, okay? So keep that stuff in mind.